Ruth, for that lovely introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, my friend and colleague, Dr. Matt Johnson. Okay, we're getting some slides. For the second time. So it's a real honor that when we invited Matt to speak for this lecture series that he accepted, we already invited Matt to speak to one of our lecture series, and I thought it was the first, so I had to go back to check. But in fact, it was the third annual lecture series in 2013. And at that time, his talk was The Birds and the Beans. And he spoke about the role of birds in coffee farms. And so Matt has had the pleasure of working with bird populations in all sorts of different environments all around the world. And tonight he's going to be talking about the role of birds in vineyards. So if you're a coffee drinker or a wine drinker, there's always something for you. But Matt was here, so Ruth dated us, letting you know that I was on this council for the 15 years that we've been organized, which is great. Soon after I arrived here in Humboldt, and Matt's been a professor in the Department of Wildlife since 1999. Sorry, not to date, but to show you the longevity of the great work he has mentored so many graduates and undergraduate students, some of whom are in the audience today, mentored faculty members, and has been a real pillar in our community doing avian ecology research about birds, again, here in Humboldt, all over California and around the world. So it's my pleasure to introduce Matt, and thanks so much for talking tonight.
All right, thanks so much for that amazing introduction. Really appreciate it. Yeah, and it's a real privilege to be here. This is a great venue. There's lots of friends and family in the audience, and welcome to everybody on Zoom. Yeah, I'm really passionate about this topic, which will be about birds, specifically songbirds and owls in winegrape vineyards, because I really feel that the future of conservation really relies on finding win-win situations between agriculture and biodiversity conservation. So when you think about narratives, or when you hear narratives about agriculture and wildlife, they usually go one of two ways. Either this way, that agriculture threatens wildlife, and of course that's true. My students know that I like quotes. I'm a fan of quotes, and here's a quote from Aldo Leopold illustrating this concept. He said, "As for diversity, what remains of our native fauna and flora remains only because agriculture has not got around to destroying it." And that's of course true. Here we go. And then there's the other narrative, the flip side of that same coin, and that is that wildlife are a threat to agriculture. And that, of course, is also true in certain settings. And again, a quote by Aldo Leopold. He said, "Agricultural science is largely a race between the emergence of new pests and the emergence of new techniques for their control." But tonight, I want to offer a third path, all right? That is the idea that can wildlife and agriculture not just coexist, but mutually thrive. That will really be the topic of today. And the focus is going to be on winegrape vineyards and wines. And maybe some of you had a glass before you came. It's an iconic, as a Californian, the winegrape industry is iconic to our state. As you can see from this figure here, it is hugely economically valuable, not just to the state of California, but really to the entire nation and to the entire world. And it's not just economically important, it's ecologically significant too, because it's grown on so many acres here in California. So that's what we'll be speaking about tonight. And before I get any farther, I want to do a proper acknowledgement to all the amazing people that have worked on this project over the years. My preferred pronoun tonight is we, because there's been so many people that have worked on this, especially graduate students. I'll call out some of them as I go through the slides here, but Eleanor, Lauren, Jadzia, Fatima, Kevin, Karen, and Cody, and Zoli have all been working with me recently. And then a number of collaborators at universities, especially at UC Davis, UC Riverside, and Cal Poly SLO. And then a number of undergraduates as well who have helped out both in the field and in the lab, and you'll see some of that as we move along. And then we've collaborated with lots of different vineyard owners, viticulturists, some of which make wine, some of which don't. And so you can see some of the wines here that the wineries that we've worked with. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a couple stories tonight. The first starts with Cialia. Cialia wakes up, it's 5 a.m., the sun is just coming up over the Vaca Range in Napa Valley, on the east side of Napa Valley. And she peers out this circular entrance to her home, and then she sees next to her 5 young babies. And they're safe, and they're warm, but they're hungry. So Cialia flies out of that entrance and enters this amazing landscape, and she immediately perches and starts looking for insects. And that's because Cialia is a western bluebird, a female western bluebird, like you see here on the right of this nest box. Here are her babies. And she and her mate need to find somewhere between 80 and 100 insects or bundles of insects, make 80 to 100 trips just that day to feed those nestlings. And those nestlings are going to grow from hatching out of an egg to being fully flighted in just 15 days. So she lives in this vineyard. She lives in the vineyard because she lives in this nest box. And the nest box has been put up by farmers. So farmers all over California have put up tens of thousands of nest boxes for birds like bluebirds in hopes that those birds might help control some of the insect pests in those farms. But nobody has really done research on this topic until my group came along. So that's really what we wanted to ask. Does this work? Is this good for the birds? Is this good for the farmers? Are they actually eating any of the pests? So we've been studying this for a few years now, and I'm going to particularly call out the work by Eleanor McDonald, who really spearheaded this experiment that we had the last couple of years. I asked Eleanor to send me a photo, and she very modestly sent me this one. So trust me, that's Eleanor doing some work in the field. But we did a big experiment. We had 20 different vineyards in Napa Valley that we were working on. 10 of them already had nest boxes for bluebirds and swallows and other birds like that. Those are in this bluish color. And then 10 did not, and those are kind of in this orangish yellow color. And we studied birds and insects on all 20 of those vineyards in 2023. And then we added nest boxes to the vineyards that didn't have them previously, so that they all had nest boxes in 2024. And we studied the birds and the insects again. And we found some really fascinating patterns that I'll summarize here. First of all, we found, this is the field of dreams hypothesis, as we sometimes call it. If you build it, they will come. You put up those nest boxes and you can increase significantly the abundance of these birds in the farm. So you can see here on the left is bluebirds, and on the right is tree swallows. That's the other species commonly attracted to these nest boxes. These are data from Eleanor McDonald, and also point out one of my other graduate students, Lauren Jackson, made these beautiful little illustrations. And you can see that from 2023 to 2024, the number of bluebirds on the vineyards that previously did not have nest boxes rose to be statistically indistinguishable from the number of bluebirds on the vineyards that already had nest boxes. And you see the same thing even more dramatically for tree swallows. So this really works. You put up these nest boxes and the birds will show up even in just 1 year. Interestingly, we also did a full valley-wide survey of all the nest boxes, well, not all of them, but 1,000 of the nest boxes across Napa Valley. And we found that roughly half of them are occupied, mostly by western bluebirds and tree swallows, but occasionally a few other species as well. And we found a few patterns. One thing is that they do prefer nest boxes that are kind of out in the open. And they also show a slight preference for nest boxes that have some kind of predator guard. So if you're in the business of thinking about buying a nest box like this, one of the best things you can do is put it in an open space. We do have tree swallows around here, not very many bluebirds, but tree swallows, and it's great to have some kind of a predator guard on it. There's different types of predator guards. We also found that the birds were a little bit more likely to occupy one of these nest boxes if there was some what we call non-crop habitat nearby, meaning some kind of a woodland around the vineyard, like you see here on the left. This is the vineyard, and then you can see some woodland and riparian type habitats around that vineyard. Those nest boxes are more likely to be occupied. And that's fascinating because we're able to understand exactly where these birds are moving. So we put these small GPS trackers on the birds, and this is done in collaboration with some colleagues at UC Davis, Cody Pham and Karen Gallardo Cruz, as well as Fatima Joma, who's a graduate student in my lab. And these GPS trackers, you can see here's a bird, a bluebird, flying around this vineyard. And you can see that that bluebird, like Cialia, is spending most of the time right in the vineyard itself. A little bit on the edge, but mostly, wow, we already got to the owls. I'm coming back. Not sure what that was. Look at that. Wow, that went really fast, huh? Almost. Okay, but we found a little bit of variation there. We found that when it was relatively cool, this is in the summer in Napa, so this is about 85 degrees when we say relatively cool. They're spending most of their time out in the middle of the vineyard. And then when it gets a little bit hotter, like around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, then they're spending a little bit more time along the edge. And then when it's even hotter, around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, they're spending even more time along the edge. So even though the birds have that preference for being in the middle of the orchard, that preference diminishes as it gets hotter and hotter, probably because they're looking for more shade and shelter in those woodlands. Okay, so that's all interesting from the bird's perspective, but from the perspective of the farmer, the idea here is that maybe these birds are eating some relevant insects. So there's lots of different insects in these vineyards. These are some of the good insects from the farmer's perspective anyway. These are some of the insects that might be predators or parasitoids of the pests. And so we can see things like this anagyrus and anagris on the top left here. These are parasitoid wasps. And then we can also see things like these lacewings, the green and brown lacewings. They're predators. The mealybug destroyer is a predator. And of course, the spiders can be predators of pests as well. And then we see the bad and the ugly. So these are the pests from the farmer's perspective. They're bad and ugly. They're actually quite beautiful. Some of them, the green sharpshooter you see in the top left, but they're a vector of disease. And so they can actually kill the grapevines. Likewise, there's two species of alfalfa hoppers you see here, those can also vector disease. And then the vine mealybug and these leaf hoppers you see over to the right are just pests that will weaken the vine if they eat on it a lot. So what did we find? Are these things in the vineyard? So what we did is we put up these sticky cards that you see in the top right. It's basically like a little fly trap that scientists use them to monitor insect populations. And we count, and again, I'm saying we, the royal we here, especially undergraduates at this part, we counted 335,000 insects from these sticky cards. And we found a lot of these, a lot of the pests. So especially vine mealybug and the leafhoppers, lots and lots of the pests. But we also found a number of the natural enemies, as we call them, or the beneficial species. So we see some spiders, we see lacewings, we see anagris and anagyrus parasitoids. Okay, so all that stuff is out there. Are the birds eating them? And for this, we did some work with genetic analysis of the bird's poop. So this is two undergraduates, Sarah and Bree, collecting poop samples. Bloop, there it was, from a tree swallow in this case. And then this is work really pioneered by our colleagues at UC Riverside. Again, Eleanor's been heavily involved with all of this work. And we extract the DNA from these target insects, both the pests and the beneficials. And we compare that to what DNA we find in the poop of the birds. And we found that, yes, both the bluebirds and the swallows are eating all of the pests that we checked for. Every single species of pests that we checked for, the birds were eating. And not at an insignificant rate, maybe on the average, somewhere close to 20% of the fecal samples that we looked for had evidence of these species. And I'll just point out that we call this the percentage of occurrence. POO. Okay, so they're eating the pests. That's good. But what about the beneficials? Are they diminishing the number of beneficials? So this is a similar chart that I showed before, but now we're looking at insects. We've got beneficial insects on the y-axis. We've got 2023 and 2024. And you can see there's no effect of adding the nest boxes at all on the beneficial insects. 2024, for some reason, was a little better than 2023 for these beneficial insects, but no real difference between the vineyards with and without the nest boxes. But then when we look at the pest species, it looks like, oh, maybe there is a little bit more of a reduction in the pests on the vineyards where we added the nest boxes compared to the control vineyards that always had the nest boxes. So let's zoom in a little bit on that and take a closer look. And what we find is this really fascinating result where we see that the effect of the birds on the pests depends on where you are in the vineyard. And that effect of the birds suppressing the pest numbers is much stronger when you're a little bit farther from the riparian and wooded habitats than when you're in the center of the vineyard. And we think that's going back to that result I showed a little bit earlier with the tracked bluebird, and that is that the nest boxes are drawing the birds a little bit more into the center of the vineyard where they can then eat those pests and provide that kind of service, if you will, to the farmers. So this is all super exciting work, and we're really looking forward to finishing up these analyses. Eleanor and Fatima and others are working very diligently to finish that up. And our next steps really for this Songbird project is to try to expand it. All this work we did in Napa Valley only, we'd like to see if some of these same patterns are happening in other wine growing regions in California. So that's been really fun work to start. But now I'm going to turn to the other story, right? And this one happens at night. So you're in the vineyard, it's getting dark, and then a different bird wakes up. This one is Yarrow, and Yarrow stretches his back against the oak tree he's sleeping in. He's been sleeping there all day, and then he flies silently across the vineyard, also to a nest box. So just like Cialia, Yarrow is on the vineyard because he's been invited there by the farmer who has put up this nest box. Both bluebirds, swallows, or all three, I should say, bluebirds, swallows, and barn owls are what we call obligate secondary cavity nesting birds. That's a mouthful, just meaning that they have to nest in some kind of cavity, a hole, and they can't make it themselves. So they're reliant on having these cavities out in the world. Now, long before European arrival, they probably did that in really old oak trees and maybe some rock cliffs and things like that. With European arrival, they started to do that in barns, hence the name barn owl. And so they're reliant on these. So this is really an amazing opportunity for these birds like Yarrow. They can nest in this nest box. And Yarrow also has hungry babies. He needs to hunt aggressively to try to feed those babies, but he's not feeding them insects. He's feeding them rodents. So my team and I have been studying barn owls now for about 11 years, mostly in Napa Valley, but more recently in other parts of the state I'll talk about in a moment. And so what I'm briefly going to do here is try to summarize some of the work we've done already, talk about some of our latest results, and then most excitingly for me, talk about some of our next steps and where we think we're going to be going with this next. Okay. So the way we monitor that is we put a GoPro on the end of an extendable pole, and we can put that camera inside the nest box. We do this during the day. So there's a male and female barn owl with their 3 eggs. So they're strictly nocturnal, so they're sleeping during the day. So this is a relatively non-invasive technique. We do sometimes capture them and tag them. I'll talk about that more later. But we can check hundreds of boxes this way, and we've been monitoring over 300 boxes now for 11 years in Napa Valley, and we've learned a lot. And this is work done and led by a bunch of different students. I'm going to call out Jamie Carlino and Samantha Chavez on this. And we've learned what types of nest boxes the birds like the most and where those nest boxes should be placed. And a really important part of the philosophy of my lab and my research is we want to do research that answers interesting ecological questions, but we also want to do research that provides some real tangible results that can be useful for farmers. So we do a lot of work trying to disseminate the information to farmers. We tell them, or offer information about what's the best way to make a nest box, where can you buy them, how should they be designed, where can they be installed. So we have a lot of information on our web pages and other sources about these tips. And we find that overall, it depends on the year, it depends on the place, but somewhere between 25 to 75% of the nest boxes are occupied by breeding barn owl families like yarrow. And the other side of this isn't just potentially good for the farmers, this is also good for the barn owls. So we carefully measure their reproduction. We know that on average, they have about 4 nestlings. And we've done some demographic modeling, including their survival rates, and shown that the rate at which they're reproducing in these vineyards is sufficient to offset their mortality. So they do have a self-sustaining population in these vineyards. We've also done testing to check for rodenticides, and at least in Napa Valley, there's no evidence of any exposure to rodenticides. And I can talk more about that if you'd like. So it does seem like it's really good for the nestlings. So look at those rascals. There's 5 in that one, right? So that's going to be one of the nests that's a little bit above average. All right. So like I said, we try to make some of this information really available for farmers. So we developed a little app that's pretty simple to use. This is just for Napa Valley, but we hope to do this for other places in the coming seasons. And with this app, a farmer can just pull up the app and then type in their address or the place where they're working. So let's say we're working on the Honig Vineyard. You can buy Honig wine, it's amazing. And so you type in where you are, you pull up the parcel, and then you just kind of do like a long click on the map, and then it'll spit out the probability that a barn owl nest box will be occupied in that place based on the habitat that's around that vineyard, based on all the statistical modeling we've done. And again, shout out to Samantha Chavez, Mimi Carlino, Rihanna Martinico, and Sarah McDonald for some of this work. So it's a really useful tool. And like I said, we're hoping to do that in other places. Okay, so we've learned a lot. We know what kind of nest boxes they like. We know how to track them. What do they eat? They eat rodents. Barn owls are little rodent killing machines. Here's a nestling, probably about 3 weeks old, choking down an entire adult gopher. Has to take a couple of breaks along the way, but eventually gets it down. Mom's in the background there. So they eat the locally available rodents, and we can tell that. We can tell that because a number of things that are relatively easy to do. Chief among them is dissecting the pellets, right? So owls consume the rodents, then they regurgitate the parts they can't digest, the bones and fur, and so you can take those apart and relatively easily identify what they're eating. This was some work led by Laura Chavez. There's a really cool KQED little video that features Laura and some of the work that she did examining their diet. But we know that, in short, they'll eat whatever is locally available. Barn owls are almost cosmopolitan. They live in lots of places around the world. Slightly different species we now know, but they basically look the same, and they'll eat whatever the local rodent is. So here in California, they're eating mostly pocket gophers and voles. That's probably about 90% of their diet in most of California. They will occasionally eat a deer mouse or even a house mouse, occasionally a roof rat, very rarely a bird, a bat, or a small rabbit. But like I said, 90% gophers and voles. And both of those are pests for lots of farmers, not just viticulturists, but certainly for the vineyard owners. So they eat the pests. How many do they eat? This was work led by Dane St. George. He put video cameras inside the nest boxes. So what you just saw was a male like yarrow coming up with prey items delivered to his babies. And we counted a lot of those deliveries with lots of different video evidence. And what Dane concluded was that an average family of barn owls, mom, dad, and about 3 to 4 kids, will eat somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 rodents a year. So they eat a lot. of rodents. Of course, there's a lot of rodents out there, right? So is that enough to make a difference? Well, that was some of the next steps. And the first work of that I'll feature is from Ash Hansen. She was a graduate student a number of years ago, and she examined gophers specifically. And she looked at gopher activity on vineyards without nest boxes. And she found that over the course of the growing season, that gopher activity increased by about 18% over that breeding season. But in the presence of those barn owl boxes, gopher activity decreased by about 14%. So this is pretty strong empirical evidence that in the presence of barn owl nest boxes, gopher activity diminished over the breeding season. So that's gophers. And then we also wanted to do a similar thing for voles and mice. And this was work led by Catherine Larson more recently. And for this work, we used a different technique. We used these little things called chew blocks. So it's like a little waxy cube with seeds and stuff embedded in it. And it's non-toxic. And it's used by the restaurant industry to monitor like where rats and rodents might be a problem. But we used it for a different purpose. We distributed them throughout the vineyard, and then we could go back and measure how many of them or what proportion of them had been chewed on as an index of what we call above ground rodent activity, meaning not gophers, instead voles and mice. And in addition, because we had done so much previous work on where the owls spend time hunting, we were able to kind of make a gradient here and do this sampling in a lot of different places. Places that have no nest boxes at all, places that have a few nest boxes or maybe just with a single owl and no kids, but and places with a lot of nest boxes and or a lot of nestlings. So we could get this gradient of hunting pressure. There should be a lot more hunting by owls here than over here. And when we look at that chew block, we see this really strong negative relationship. The higher the hunting pressure, the lower the percentage of the chew blocks that got chewed. So again, we have pretty strong evidence that the owls are actually not just eating lots and lots of rodents, they're capable of diminishing the activity and abundance of both gophers and voles and mice. But how much does it cost? So we collaborated with some economists to try to figure out how we can estimate the cost of the nest box, how long they'll last, how often they need to be cleaned, if they need to be cleaned when they're occupied or not, the cost of all that, and then we sort of prorate that over time, the longevity of the box, and we can express that as dollars per acre per year or dollars per rodent removed per year. And then we could compare that to really what is right now the only other alternative to controlling rodents without chemicals, and that is trapping. So with these rodents in these vineyards, like I said, it's mostly voles, mice, and gophers. The two dominant trapping techniques are just plain old snap traps, like you see in the top there, you have here in the village, as well, and those are for voles and mice. As well as something called a McAfee trap, which you see in the top right there, that little line drawing, and that's used for gophers. And so some of the vineyards that we collaborated with, specifically Gurgitch Hills here, that's where these photos came from, they had a big rodent problem and they were paying their workers to do loads and loads of trapping to try to get rid or at least reduce the number of these rodents. And I should point out, this is the damage that can happen. So here you can see this vine was nearly completely girdled. As you probably know, if you're a wine drinker, sometimes these vines can live 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 years. So they're really valuable, and losing an entire vine can be devastating. So it's a big deal to try to control these rodents. So we did our economic calculations, and we found that the barn owl boxes are way cheaper than trapping. Trapping just costs so much in labor. Whereas with the barn owl box, you buy the box and you put it up, and then the owls do the work, not your laborers, right? So somewhere between 9 and 10 times cheaper than trapping. There is a caveat on that though, and that is that the barn owl nest boxes work best when rodent populations are low to medium. So there's kind of a lot going on in this graph, so I'll kind of walk us through here, but on the x-axis, we have the cost per acre, so sort of the investment, like how many nest boxes are being deployed. And then on the y-axis, we have what's called the efficacy, which is basically the percentage of rodents that are removed by the barn owls. And then we have gophers, that right here. Yeah, we have gophers in orange and mice and voles, which we can't distinguish in this modeling in yellow. And then we have 3 panels at low rodent density, medium rodent density, and high rodent density. So you can see at low rodent density, if you're investing, 20 to 35 or so dollars per acre, the owls are going to remove most of the rodents. At medium density, though, because sometimes the rodent population spikes, the owls are going to remove maybe 50, 60%. And then when the rodent density gets really high, the owls are going to do their part, but they're only removing 25, maybe %. So the bottom line here is that the owl boxes are a great tool to help maintain lower rodent numbers in most years, but occasionally when those rodent numbers spike, which rodents sometimes do, especially voles, then it's time to do something else. And we recommend trapping, which is going to be expensive, but you can get those numbers back down. And then in most years, the owls should be able to do what they're going to do. Okay, so that's all really exciting stuff. We think we have some really good results to offer to the farmers. We're always interested in these questions, like what can we do next? So the thing that we're most excited about now is trying to pinpoint exactly where the birds are killing prey. So for that, I'm going to talk about a couple of projects just in the last 2 summers. We've been working now, not just in Napa, but also expanded into Lodi, California, Central Valley, as well as down by San Luis Obispo. We monitored about 500 barn owl boxes. And then now we're also doing some GPS tracking of their behavior. So we put on these little backpacks, a little GPS tracker. We've tagged 91 adult barn owls. And those GPS trackers take a location every second. So we get really detailed information about where the birds are going. They're also fitted with an accelerometer, which I'll say more about in a moment. So really, the 2 questions we're addressing immediately are these 2. We want to evaluate fine scale movements and behavior using the GPS tracker. And then we also want to quantify where and where the owls hunt and where they're attacking prey. My graduate student, Lauren Jackson, I'll show you some of her slides and data here in a moment. She's also asking a really interesting question that we don't have time to talk about today, and she's just getting into the analysis, but it's going to be super exciting. She's looking at the relationship between owl personality and hunting style. So that'll be cool. But we're going to focus on those first couple of things. Here's Lauren, and there's Yarrow, who I introduced a little earlier in my story. And we did this work in Lodi. Lauren was leading it. And there was one nest box that was close to the Lodi Wine Visitor Center, so it had Wi-Fi available. So we got a camera on it. We had a live stream, and that's who we named Poppy and Yarrow. Yarrow is the male. So Lauren's got some great tools you could check out. So the way we capture them is we use this thing called a porch trap. So it's a device that we strap onto the front of the nest box. Here's the owl's nest box. Here's a little arm that's holding the camera. And then we put this up. The owls get used to it. We put it up so that the door won't shut. Once the owls get used to it, then we arm it. And then this happens at night. The video kind of makes this look like it's daytime, but it's during the night. And we're parked like a quarter mile away in the truck. And so when the owl comes back with a rodent, as you can see, to feed his or her babies, his in this case, then the door shuts, turns the lights on, and then we know, oh, we got an owl. So we can zoom up there and then take the owl out, and then we can put on the GPS. And so here are the data from the owls that Lauren banded in Lodi. All those little spaghetti squiggles are the tracks of these different owls in Lodi. So then there's a lot of analysis that needs to happen with that. And so I'm going to use Yarrow as a single example to kind of illustrate some of the steps we do to analyze things. So here is a track of Yarrow for just one night. His nest box is right there, Biz 1. So you can see he flies out, he does stuff, he flies back. But we can use all this information to try to understand a little bit more what that owl is doing. And so what we first do is some models that are called hidden Markov models, which basically look at how fast the bird is flying and how quickly or severely it's turning to try to classify different behaviors. And so then we can classify behaviors into perching, these yellow spots where they're pretty much just sitting in one place, and then these commuting flights where they're going really fast and straight compared to more hunting style flights. And then we break the hunting into two colors here, but they're both blue and we're going to lump them for today's purposes. That's when they're flying a little bit more slowly and more sinuously. They're looking or listening for prey, occasionally attacking. And so we're most interested, especially in those hunting strikes. But how they spend their time is fascinating behaviorally. So here you see Yarrow still on the left with the colors of his different ways of behaving depicted on the track. And then here you see all the different owls that Lauren tracked in Lodi. Each bar is an owl, and the percentage of time they spent perching or hunting or commuting is depicted. So as expected, you know, most animals aren't flying and hunting all the time. They're standing around and waiting. But they do a lot of hunting, and you can also see a lot of variation among them. And we can zoom in here just on Yarrow. There we go. There's Yarrow. So Yarrow's a good one. You know, he perches a lot, but he's also hunting an awful lot. So that's an example of some of the individual variations. So we want to know more about those hunting locations. So we filter out the perching and the commuting and look just at those hunting locations. And then we can do that for all the birds across the whole study area, which is fascinating in and of itself. But of course, it gets a lot more interesting when you underlay that with the land cover types that those birds are hunting in. So different colors are depicting different types of habitat and different crops. And then we can see that, at least for Lauren's study, the birds were spending about 50% of their hunting time in the vineyards, and about 20 or 30% of their time in pasture and grass, and then way less time in some of the other habitats. So they are hunting an awful lot in the vineyards. But once again, we see a tremendous amount of individual variation. So again, each of these bars is an individual owl, and some owls, like this one way over here to the right, hunts almost exclusively in vineyard in that purple color. And other owls, like this guy, hunts barely at all in the vineyards. And again, we can take a look at Yarrow. How'd Yarrow do? There's his track on the left, and you can see, oh yeah, quite a bit of it's in that purple color. So how does he match up? Oh, there he is. He's a good one. So he spends a lot of time hunting in the vineyard. So we're really interested in that individual variation. And then another one of my students, Jadzia Rodriguez, has done very similar work back in that Napa study area. But she also tagged males and females. Lauren focused on the males because the males do the majority of the hunting. It's fascinating to also look at both pairs. So again, similar type of graph here where the different colors are depicting different habitats, vineyard again in purple. And you can see that, you know, some of them are spending a lot of time hunting in vineyard, but some of them a little bit less. And you can see a lot of variation. You can see the males and females. But what's really interesting about Jadzia's data is that she's, in many cases, tagged the male and female from the same nest box, a pair. And so here we've got a pair of birds from the Gurgitch Hills vineyard. And you can see both the male and the female are spending most of their time hunting on vineyards. But in contrast, here's another vineyard, the Bouchain vineyard. Anybody been there? Great Carneros, Pinot, and Chardonnay. The female is doing a whole bunch of hunting on the vineyards, whereas the male is doing very little. So again, that individual variation is something we're really fascinated by. Okay, then the very last thing that we're trying to do now is to make more use of our little GPS trackers. So as I mentioned, these GPS trackers are all fitted with an accelerometer. You all have an accelerometer in your pocket. Our phones have little accelerometers in them. It's a tiny device. It's used like if you're playing a video game, for example, to tell your phone how you're moving the phone around. So it's a little tiny sensor, and it measures acceleration, so forceful, force-induced movement, in 3 different axes. So they call these triaxial accelerometers. So there's a vertical axis, we call that heave. So positive would be going up, negative would be going down. Surge axis is going forward, or negative would be going backwards. And then the sway axis is sideways movements left to right. And these GPS trackers take accelerometer data 50 times a second. So you get incredibly detailed information, but it does take a lot of manipulation to figure out what all that means. Fortunately, some colleagues that we have in Switzerland have figured out that there's a very conspicuous signature in the accelerometer data when the owls strike prey. So when the owls strike prey, there's a huge negative and then a rapid, huge positive heave, because they're going down rapidly and then they decelerate to zero when they strike prey. And that's way different. That looks very different from when they just regularly land on a branch or something. So we can use this accelerometer data then to identify exactly when they're hunting or when they're striking prey. We match that up to the GPS tracker, and then we can put a little X on the map for where they struck a rodent. So this is work that's done by Kevin Garcia Lopez down at San Luis Obispo. The other students, Lauren and Jedzia, will be doing this soon as well. And so here you can see the nest box. And then the owl flies out here. These points are just 1 second apart. So you can see it's flying kind of slowly, toodles around for a while, and then whammo, there's a prey strike. And then you can see it flies quickly. The dots are farther apart because it's flying faster, back to the nest box to feed its babies. So that's what we're most excited about now, is to put all these little X's on the map to where they're attacking prey, because we're most interested in how that might relate to farm management. So if you've driven around vineyards, you probably just last past them, but next time you do, take a look. There's a lot of variation there. There's some with cover crops, some without. There's some with complex trellising, some that are called head prune. And there's some with very little habitat nearby, some with woodlands and little lakes and all kinds of stuff. And all that habitat heterogeneity probably matters to the owls, probably affects where they hunt and when. And so ultimately, that's the question that we're most interested in, is how do vineyard management practices and farm complexity affect where the owls are hunting? So back to this very first question I introduced at the beginning: can wildlife and agriculture mutually thrive? Hopefully, you're convinced that the answer is, at least in some cases, an emphatic yes. And so I'll bring another quote from Aldo Leopold. He said, "When the land does well for its owner and the owner does well by their land, when both end up better by reason of their partnership, then we have conservation." And to me, that's really the bottom line, is trying to understand this relationship. And ecologists talk a lot about ecosystem services. What are the services that wildlife or nature provide people? That's a good way to talk about it scientifically, but maybe not the most relevant to how we live our lives. And so some of you have probably read this book by Robin Morrill Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass, and she talks about a gift economy. She says gifts from the earth or from each other establish a particular relationship, an obligation of sorts you give, to receive, and to reciprocate. And I think that's the best way to think about these nest boxes and these farmers. The farmers and the birds are engaged in a gift economy. The farmers can give the birds these nest boxes, which they need to nest in. And in return, the birds are going to do what birds do. They're going to eat insects, they're going to eat rodents, and they can all mutually thrive. And in so doing, the farmers almost always enriched their lives by just having these birds around. And I can't tell you how many times farmers have taken me aside and said, "Oh, it's so great that they're eating the rodents. It's so great that they're eating the insects. That's amazing. I think I'd put up the boxes anyway." I hear that story all the time because there's all these other values that these birds are bringing to the farms. So I'll conclude by just acknowledging that I think that reciprocity of what the birds can provide the farmers as a gift, and what the farmers can exchange, provide as a gift for the birds, is really a positive way to think about it. And with that, I'd like to thank the funders, especially USDA, the ARI, and the Humboldt Area Foundation. And then the little QR code there brings you to a website that has a whole bunch of other information we have, and you can follow us on social media if you'd like. And I have time for some questions. Thanks very much. Yes, way in the back first.
So there are times when the vineyards are both they're using owls, but they're also using traffic from the Is there any, problems with that, like that the owls are getting, trying to get the rodents?
Yeah, okay, yeah, great question. So the question is, if a vineyard owner or any farmer is using both barn owl boxes and trapping, is that any kind of a problem? And so, yeah, the answer to that question is no. So the barn owls won't eat carrion, they won't eat dead things at all. And they're not regularly getting on the ground and walking around and have any danger of getting trapped by the traps. I will say that the traps do occasionally get other things, especially lizards. Occasionally small birds, but lizards seem to be the most prominent bycatch. What is a greater concern is the scenario where the vineyard owner, or again, any farmer, is using a barn owl box and rodenticide at the same time. And that's something that we're looking at very carefully. Some of you might know that the state of California passed a new piece of legislation, AB 2554, I think it is, which makes California now have the strictest anti-rodenticide laws anywhere in the world. But there are still some exceptions, and there are some rule breakers as well. So there are some rodenticides out there. Like I said, we have tested a lot of the owls in Napa for rodenticide exposure, and we had 0. So I don't think it's a huge problem because the owls are not getting those rodents. Those rodents are often dying underground. But still, it's a terrible toxicant, and we're trying to get it out of the system. And so that's why when we talk about all these things to farmers, we talk about owls and trapping. Those are your chemical-free solutions. Yeah, great question. Yes.
When you put the bird boxes in the vineyards, did you say that you saw a reduction in pest insects, but not in beneficial insects?
That's right. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on why that would be?
I don't know. The pests are generally more abundant, although it depends a little bit on which pests you're talking about. Some of the beneficials are spiders, and neither the bluebirds nor the swallows eat a lot of spiders. And then, yeah, I'm not really sure other than that. In fact, I will say I was a little surprised at the result overall. Some of those pests are so small that I was a little skeptical that we would find very much of them in the diet. But then the DNA comes back and it says 20% of the birds are eating the pests. So, yeah, kind of amazing. But there are the pest concentrations can get high at times at places. And anytime you have a concentration of insects, the birds are going to respond. Yeah.
Maybe those predators stay south.
Maybe. I mean, they should be less abundant right there, a predator compared to the herbivore. Yeah.
If barn owls now, bluebirds, any other kind that's gonna be good at these guys are gonna be like bats. They could fill gaps.
Yes, bats. I'd love to do some work on bats. We put in 2 proposals, neither have been funded. Yeah, there's another really important insect pest in a variety of crops. It's called navel orange worm. It does hit navel oranges, but it's actually a bigger problem for nut crops like walnuts and almonds in particular. And it's a moth. So it has a caterpillar that does the damage on the husk of the walnuts and almonds. But the adult is a night-flying small moth, which seems like that's great potential bat food. I'd love to figure out, and bats can also be attracted to farms with boxes. They don't always nest in them, or reproduce in them, but they'll be attracted. So I think, yeah, there is possibility for that. Yeah.
Thanks, just amazing talk. It's really cool to see the sort of, if you know, they will come story for the bluebirds.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of the economics of it, specifically with barn owl boxes, is there some understanding that more boxes will mean more owls colonizing an area, or is there sort of an optimal level for having pets who might want owl boxes?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about barn owls is they're not territorial. So the advice we always say is, put a few up if you have 0 to start with, and if they get occupied, keep building. It's like the hotel manager, if you got a full vacancy, you need to expand. And we have some pretty amazing stories of vineyards. We have one vineyard, Gurgitch Hills Vineyard in American Canyon. I mean, they have 39, 41, something like that boxes. Their occupancy rate is still 80–90%. It's phenomenal. Yeah, I mean, at night, that place is just swarming at the Cleveland barn owls. It's incredible. They're almost semi-colonial, I think. Yeah, fascinating. Another hand, see,
I was just wondering, obviously, I think barn owls were easiest to study because they nest the way they do, but what can you say about other types of owls that can help them?
Yeah, great question. So we do sometimes get screech owls even in the little nest boxes, the barn owl nest boxes, and they'll also nest in natural cavities and oak trees. And they might provide some service, but really screech owls will eat like little moths, grasshoppers, occasionally a mouse, but they're not nearly as focused rodent specialists like the barn owls are. And then the other owl that's common, throughout California as well as the rest of the country is great horned owls. And great horned owls will actually kill barn owls. So one of the patterns that we found is that if a farm has a lot of proper forests around it, not just like woodland oak savanna, but proper forests, there's likely to be a great horned owl nearby. And if there's one or more great horned owls, sometimes there aren't so many barn owl boxes. So one of the tools I didn't show you, but we have another tool that shows for the vineyard managers that already have nest boxes, the likelihood that a barn owl is going to hunt in that area. And some of them, really show like, okay, you've got 6 boxes, that's great, but they're not occupied and you have so much forest nearby. I don't think this is a good place for owl boxes. So we just have to have that honesty, like, okay, this is a great tool in many places, but it doesn't work in every situation. And one of those reasons it doesn't work in some places is because the great horned owls. Yeah.